Welcome to GRE Snacks, snackable episodes about the GRE, GMAT, and graduate school admissions. I'm Tyler, the founder of Achievable, and we have a full GRE course that includes everything you need to ace your GRE exam. A full textbook, videos on key topics, tons of GRE questions backed by our memory-enhancing algorithm, a built-in study planner and essay grader, and full-length practice exams. You can try it out for free at achievable.me, and if you like it, use the code podcast to get you 10% off. Now, let's get started. Today, we've got Charles Bibilos from GMATNinja joining us again. Charles, I'd love if you could introduce yourself.
Sure. Thanks for having me again, Tyler. So I'm Charles from GMATNinja. I've been started tutoring GRE about 25 years ago. About 15 years ago, decided to hang out a shingle as GMATNinja, which makes less and less sense over the years as we teach more and more GRE. And yeah, former professional dancer, and that's how I got into this. It was the thing that complemented my dance career, and 25 years later, still here.
Nice. I did not know that about you, actually.
Really, I can't believe we never talked about that.
Yeah, they'll have to be. That's more of like a behind the scenes, the making of GMATNinja podcast or something like that. But cool, man. So today we're going to be talking about why you shouldn't binge study. And I mean, we're obviously proponents of this, which I can get into later. But to start, you had a story that you wanted to talk about that was somewhat related to this.
Yeah, we get these wonderful, and again, a very large proportion of our students at GMAT Ninja are applying for MBAs, and so Masters in Business Administration, get the occasional PhD student. Some people applying for other random programs, but that MBA crowd, man, I mean, a lot of them are super type A personalities. They're
Mhm.
trying to end up in the C-suite of a company. They work their butts off. That's great. We love it when our students do their homework. We had a student a couple years ago who was had a lot of anxiety issues. Unsurprisingly, when I say the rest of this, he worked his butt off. It was amazing. I mean, he was just grinding through the homework, sitting down trying to do 3, 4, 5 hours a day, 6 hours a day of homework after he got home from work. He wasn't sleeping. His results were actually pretty erratic and terrible at times because he was overdoing it. And his tutor was yelling at him. And by the way, this tutor was a captain in the army, went to West Point. So it's not like she's easy on students necessarily, but she was like, hey, take it easy, take it easy. Sometimes less is more, make it good quality studying. Now, this same
Mhm.
student um, told us a story somewhat proudly as his tutor, Dana, is telling him to take it easy, not study so much, study wisely, not just excessive quantities of it. And he said, well, but I've always succeeded by studying super hard. He's like, well, that's cool. He's like, I even cracked my cornea once. He's like, what did you just say? He's like, yeah, I cracked my cornea once. So when this student was an undergrad, he he literally moved into the library for the last week before finals, and that was kind of part of the culture of the school he went to. He slept in the library, what little he slept,
Okay.
and it was in a hot climate at least that time of year, so it was very air conditioned, so it was dry air conditioned air, and he was sitting there studying for 18, 20, 22 hours straight, taking a little nap for a few hours, waking it up and doing it all over again, doing that for the last week before final exams. And between that dry air and the fact that he had his eyes open staring at textbooks for, 100 hours over 5 days, he cracked his cornea. That's apparently a thing that can happen from overstudying. The point is, we don't want you to crack your cornea. We use that as sort of our little shorthand for overstudying. And obviously, he took it to an extreme. And I really respect his work ethic and lovely human being. But when you approach these standardized tests, that's not what you want. More volume doesn't get you as far as you necessarily want it to.
Hmm. Well, and it's like, I mean, I've always wondered about people like that, but I'm also just the total opposite. I have no idea, like, i- if there's psychology studies about this or anything, but I've always found that, if you're studying 100 hours in a week or whatever, you would probably do just as well studying like 50 hours and like taking some breaks and like having your brain turn off from time to time. Because I do feel like, at a certain point, you're just kind of pouring in water into an already full cup and you're just not really getting very much out of the extra time. That's my unprofessional opinion, but
I
curious what
think
you think.
I think that's spot on, Tyler. Fundamentally, that the diminishing returns become so severe that how much are you really accomplishing in hour number 20 in a day? Are you learning
hmm
10% as much as you did in hour number one? Maybe.
hmm
Is it worth it? Probably not. But
Right.
even that, I think is, hey, if you're
Like
studying for the test,
if you took a break, let's say a 10-hour break, and then you came back and worked for 5 hours after that, I feel like you'd get more out of it. I don't know.
yeah, I think that's fundamentally true. But here's the thing, I think that's even more true when you're talking about a standardized test like the GRE or the GMAT instead of something that's a knowledge based test. So let's suppose that you're taking organic chemistry and you just need to memorize a whole bunch of formulas or whatever. I've never taken organic chemistry, but I hear it's a lot of memorization. So if that's the case for you, you could argue that more volume is good. The more time you spend memorizing stuff you need to memorize for that type of test maybe is a good thing up to a certain
hmm
point where your brain starts to turn into jello and a break would make your studying more effective. But the GRE is a totally different animal. It's not a memorization test. There's not a lot of knowledge on it. So
hmm
they call the sections verbal reasoning and quantitative reasoning. They don't call it math and reading. The reason for that is that they're basically trying to build reasoning puzzles off of basic math. They're trying to build reasoning puzzles off of the English language. So it's about your reasoning skill, how well you can think, draw inferences, creatively solve problems in quant. That's what they're going after. We can argue about how well they achieve it, but the point is that on a test like that, you need your brain to work flexibly. You need to be able to read really sharply. There's very, very little that's worth memorizing. Should you know your geometry formulas for the GRE? Of course. Um, should you spend a lot of time memorizing words for vocabulary words for the GRE verbal section? We can argue about whether that's a good strategy. I think we did that in a podcast once, Tyler. But bottom line is that that's going to be anything you can memorize for the GRE is a very, very small part of the test. So when you need your brain to work flexibly, when you need to be able to reason and think and read with precision, fatigue is your enemy. If you're exhausted when you do it, you're going to start underperforming really, really, really quickly, which is why overstudying for the GRE can be so much more dangerous than overstudying for an economics exam or a chemistry exam.
Yeah, well, not just overstudying, but also kind of being over prepared, right? Like I feel like the GRE, while it does have, a fair amount that you need to remember how to do, it's not, like you said, a trivia test. It's much more of like a deduction and application test. So, to an extent, there is like a fixed universe of stuff that you need to know. And, it's not small. This test is hard, but it's not super big. It's not like Jeopardy contestant level either, right? So, definitely, I think, yeah, I agree with everything you've said so far about basically like binge studying, particularly the last week before the GRE, is not really the best plan. I would say also, as you're going through and you're studying over the course of, call it 3 months or whatever, it is also strongly preferred and also like much more effective to be studying consistently over that time rather than, doing more of it at the beginning or more of it at the end or things like that.
100% Tyler. Couldn't agree more. What you really are, what ideal looks like for the GRE, and again, it might vary depending on your lifestyle and your application timeline and all that stuff. But let's suppose that you're looking for a significant improvement. You're trying to gain, I don't know, let's call it 5 to 8 points on each section of the GRE
hmm
on the quant and verbal. Okay, that's the sort of thing that maybe will take you again for the sake of a round number. Let's say that that's 3 months of studying. Ideally, what we want to see is a nice, consistent 2 hours a day. Maybe you do a little more on the weekends. But if you get to that fourth or fifth hour in a single day, what we see over and over and over and over, with very, very rare exceptions, if any, is that as you get into that third, fourth, fifth hour of studying, your brain starts to go a little bit. You might not feel consciously tired, especially if you had a lot of Red Bull, but you're going to start making mistakes. Your reading becomes less crisp. You're more likely to misread something on reading comp. You're more likely to miss some little clue in text completion or sentence equivalence that unlocks a little question for you. You're more likely to botch a little piece of arithmetic or algebra on the quant. And this is the really key part, I think, for the GRE. It's an adaptive exam. So what that
hmm
means is that, hey, difficulty of the questions is going to get harder if you perform well on that first section of quant or first section of verbal. You're going to see an easier section if you perform poorly. And your score isn't determined just by the number of questions you get right or wrong, it's determined by the difficulty level. So you're going to have a much higher score if you, so you put it this way, if you start missing questions that you're capable of getting right, especially in that first section, it really damages your score enormously. It's not just about how many you miss, it's what you miss. You miss questions that are easy for you. That's the apocalypse on an adaptive test like the GRE or GMAT.
Mm,
So coming back to the binge studying, if you're studying in a way that's excessive and the fatigue starts to set in, you start making goofy errors. At that point, you're not helping yourself. You're actually hurting yourself because you're just becoming more effective at making silly errors. And those are the things that kill your
right.
score. Job number one, if it's a question that you can handle in a reasonable amount of time and it's something you understand how to do, you can't miss it. That's the nature of adaptive testing. And
Mhm.
overstudying, binge studying, doing too much in a day, pushing too hard really, really hurts your ability to execute well.
Right. Well, and it's yeah, again, it's about precision here, right?
Yep. Yep.
So like for instance, like I don't know, NFL athletes don't like spend the whole summer like just like grinding at the gym as hard as they possibly could every day, right? Like they like mix it up, like they do some stuff one day, some stuff another day, they have rest days, right? It's like it's kind of a similar thing. I also think there's, I mean, I'm curious, in addition to talking about kind of spacing out studying and things like that, um, do you feel like there's a particular study schedule that is sort of the best practice for, say, like an 8 week or a 12-week timeline? Or is that too kind of, I guess, case by case?
I mean, it's always case by case. It depends on what score you need, how far you are from your target score. You might be really unbalanced,
Mm,
need a lot of work on quant, very little on verbal, or vice versa. So it's going to depend in a lot of ways. I think general principles, if you have 8 weeks or 12 weeks to study, or even 5 weeks, 4 weeks or 5 weeks, you want to keep it as balanced as you can. So again, I want
mhm,
nice, consistent, 2 or 3 hours a day. Maybe you can get to a fourth hour if you're not working on that day or not attending classes somewhere else. But as soon as you get to hour number five, it usually gets ugly. If you need work on both quant and verbal, you want to keep it balanced. So we see people all the
mhm,
time who binge on quant, even though they need to work on verbal and they worry about verbal later, or vice versa. That's a terrible idea. Get a nice mix of everything you need to work on early on. Get a nice mix of topics too. So let's suppose that you only need to work on quant, your verbal's fine. What you
mhm,
don't want to do is say, well, this week I'm going to study geometry, and next week I'm going to study algebra, and the week after that I'm going to study percentages. That's another form of binging that's really bad for you because you want that consistent practice over time. You don't need to study geometry every single
yeah,
day.
you want consistent practice with all the topics, right?
Yes, exactly. So, ideally, what you're doing, maybe if you have a really long ways to go, let's say on quant, maybe in the very, very early going, you're focusing on the most common topics. So maybe you're focusing on
Mhm,
arithmetic and algebra and maybe some word problems in geometry to kind of really get those foundations built if you're fairly new to that stuff. Maybe you hyper focus early on, but once you kind of get into the meat of your prep, you should be getting a nice consistent diet of everything over time so that let's say that you study geometry, let's say you don't know any geometry, you go to take this test. So you spend the first week going, oh wow, I don't remember any geometry. I'm going to go learn a bunch of geometry. That's my big weakness. Everything else needs practice but isn't a mess. Okay, great. Learn all that stuff early on. Then after that, I want you seeing geometry every couple days, ideally, just to make sure that it
mhm.
gets reinforced and you see that practice. It doesn't need to be every day, but every couple of days so that you get that nice reinforcement. Um, so ideally, what you're doing over those, whatever it might be, 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 12 weeks, longer for some unfortunate souls, just keep it
Mhm.
consistent, keep it mixed as best you can. That's what's going to make your prep as efficient as it can be, and keep the number of hours you have to suffer through this at a minimum over time.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And I mean, it's funny, like this is not planned or this is not an advertisement, but that's exactly what Achievable software program does. We are trying to get you to re-review everything as you're going along forward, studying the new things. And then, we have a computer algorithm that determines the best time for you to do that. But you can do it without Achievable on your own too. just by employing those practices, right? At the end of the day, spaced review is not a radical concept, and it's the idea of making sure you're keeping up with everything, particularly things that you're struggling with as you go forward with the new things. And that works really well.
So yeah, the way Tyler, if I'm not mistaken, I think the way you created some of your algorithm was you kidnapped me, downloaded my brain into your computer, and then yeah.
You should be mistaken because you were not supposed to remember that. But anyway.
um, no, and a lot of that, some of those principles have been part of education research for decades. The idea of spaced repetition being effective in helping you remember how to do things, and again, coming at it from kind of a non-technical perspective, right? For me, it's been hands-on, one-on-one with students for 25 years now, and intuitively, anecdotally, what we see over and over is, yeah, when you try to binge on probability and then you don't touch it for 2 weeks, so
Mhm.
much of the time it is just gone 2 weeks later. And part of the joke of it all is that you don't need a lot of repetition, especially when you pick on something as minor as probability. It's a very small proportion of the GRE. You don't need it. There's not a ton of variety in the questions. You don't need a ton of repetition. You go do a few questions here and there every week, maybe in mixed practice sets or in practice sets, wherever they might appear. A lot of different ways to skin that cat. But once you've kind of learned it, if you ignore it, it disappears fast for a lot of students. But it doesn't take a lot to maintain it. Handful of questions a week, maybe scattered in other sets, and you're okay.
Right. Yeah, and just focusing on like doing your best to kind of keep track of what you're doing well in and not well in, so that you can focus on the areas that you're not doing well in. That's another big one because through the repetition, you can also improve your score over time. Like repetition is not just for maintenance; it can also lead to you getting better scores as you like basically have more practice with the topic.
And sometimes the spacing part. So when we're talking about not binging, right? So we see people who are like,
Mm,
again, our good friend with the recovering from his cracked cornea. His mentality was, okay, I just learned a new concept. I just spent 3 days studying it like crazy, and now I'm going to practice it every day. um, you don't need to do that. And one of the funny things about memory development around learning, especially when what the GRE is asking you to do is use it, not just regurgitate it. There's a difference. So,
mm,
quantitative reasoning, what they're asking you to do is solve a puzzle built around that probability concept. And when the GRE is at its most creative, they're finding different ways to present those questions, ideally.
mm,
So, when you think of it that way, sometimes what actually strengthens your ability to do that is getting the right amount of distance from something. When you first learn something, maybe you're kind of in memorization mode. Oh, I'm going to learn all the steps for solving this kind of probability question. I'm going to memorize this formula. That's often our mindset when we learn a new thing, especially on quant. Yeah, that's important. That's really valuable for you on the GRE. If you're going for that elite quant score, what you want is for it to become working knowledge that you understand with more depth and flexibility. Sometimes that comes with a little bit of distance. You get a few days where you
mm,
don't do it, question pops up in a mixed practice set where you're doing a bunch of other quant things, and then all of a sudden you start seeing it from a different angle. That's
mhm.
often how our depth of understanding gets built, and that's valuable too, especially if you're shooting for a super high score. So it's not there's no need to repeat every single day. It's getting enough of it to be efficient in your studies, not ignoring it, not binging on it, and finding that sweet spot where you're doing just enough once you kind of understand a concept. And yeah, to your point, Tyler, that can actually move you forward and not just treading water.
Yeah, and it also, I think again, not to get too deep in the weeds on how memory works, but I think that you literally remember things better if you have to take a day or two off and then you have to remember them versus remembering them every day. Like
Yeah,
there's something about like having to reach for it a little bit and be like, what was that again? As opposed to being like, yes, I understand because I did this yesterday.
yeah,
And yeah, I'm not a psychologist, but there seems to be something there.
yeah. We're gonna run way into the weeds here. There's a lot of value in reinforcing early after you learn something. So reinforcing within a day or two after learning a new concept. After that, kind of what you're describing, Tyler, is related to where a lot of the research has been headed on learning and memory development is when you struggle, that's where a lot of the learning really happens. That's what really solidifies things. So when you
Mm,
say, okay, ideally what we're doing is you learn something new, you reinforce it fairly soon, then you start spacing out that reinforcement a little bit. And
mm.
ideally, what happens is when you encounter it maybe a few days later and it's in a different form, ideally, it is in a slightly different form where you do struggle a little bit and you really have to kind of build those layers of reasoning in that the GRE and GMAT love to test. That's when that really strengthens into something better, stronger, more flexible, is through that struggle as the questions start changing a little bit down the road once you've had a little bit of space from them. So, yeah, you're absolutely barking up the right tree with all that.
Yeah, great. Well, yeah, so then I guess the only, like, the way that I'd want to kind of steer this to wrap up here is just to say, like, okay, you shouldn't binge study. What's the formula instead, right? Maybe it's for the last couple weeks of the last month or even the last week. Like, how do you kind of basically, I want to make sure we're leaving with constructive advice, and not just a bunch of sort of like anecdotes about types of studying.
I think it's figuring out getting a sense of how long you need to study. Sometimes you don't know that when you first start your journey because you don't know how fast you'll improve. But what you're looking to do is build it into your life so that it doesn't completely take over your life. So again, a nice steady 2 hours a day, maybe an hour and a half is all you can do. That's fine, but just do it every day. Be nice and consistent, fit it into your life so that you still have a life. Keep doing things for yourself. Have a social life. Don't say bye-bye to your friends and binge study. So nice and steady, get your hour and a half, 2 hours, 3 hours in a day, whatever you can do. And just keep that up. That as far as when we say don't binge study, that's what we mean. We want you to be efficient. The fewest hours you can spend studying in order to achieve your goal. Now that's going to vary enormously depending on how far you are from your goals, but not a lot of magic to it. You just want it to be a nice, consistent dosage every day, every week, same thing. You get up. Ideally, you're studying at the same time every day if you can, if your schedule allows it. And you keep that up until you're close to your test. And you can dial back a little bit in those last few days before your exam. You definitely don't want to ramp it up like that last week before your exam. It's time to maybe reinforce anything that really needs it. Maybe take a practice test early in the week, but then take good care of your body. I mean, keep kind of your mojo going. Do enough practice that you feel like everything is comfortable and familiar. But certainly at the end, if anything, you're studying a little bit less. Take care of your body, get your rest, enjoy life a little bit seriously without doing bad things to your brain and body, and that's it, nice and steady. And that's really it's not sexy at all. Like people want to hear things that make great sound bites and are maybe kind of extreme. Hey, move into the library and sleep there all night until your cornea cracks. That's how you're going to get an A+ on this test.
Yeah, the only problem is you just aren't hustling hard enough, right?
Yes. And that's not it for this test. It's like, yeah, for some of you, if you have a really long ways to go to hit your goal, you might put a ton of hours into this. You might not need that many hours, but the goal is always efficiency and its steadiness. Good, sustainable amount of practice every day. That's it. When you're done for the day, don't push to do more. You did your whatever it might be for you, 2 hours, hour and a half, 3 hours. You did it. You check the box. Forget about it. Come back the next day with a clean mind. And that's the best way to get it done with the minimum amount of pain, progressing as quickly as you can. Keep it balanced through that whole study period.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you so much. This has been GRE Snacks, hosted by Tyler from Achievable with Charles Bibilos from GMATNinja. And Achievable has a great online GRE course you can try for free at achievable.me and use the code podcast to get 10% off.